Hi, we complete 1 Samuel 26 today after David is called to Abner and Abner hasn't responded, but Saul has finally recognized the voice of David. And so now the conversation shifts from David chastising Abner and the men for not watching out for their Lord the King, like Yahweh's anointed, to the conversation between David and Saul about what has been going on for the last 3 chapters, as we hear in the beginning of verse 18 on the left side of the screen, David saying, "Why does my Lord pursue his servant? For what have I done? What guilt is on my hands?" And so as we enter into this closing passage, we've been looking at the comparison between chapter 24 and 26. And if you haven't been following these, I really encourage you to look at the introductory video to chapter 24, which shows, at least initially, how these 3 chapters are tightly bound together, with the chapter with Nabal and Abigail in chapter 25 being a symbol of David's struggle with Saul, with Nabal as Saul in that story. So we can see in the comparison with chapter 24 and 26, the color-coded pieces are the parts that match, and the non-coded pieces are the parts that are unique to each section. So we're on this section now today, and you see most of it is unique to our section. So one of the differences has been that in the last one, here in chapter 24, David symbolically castrated the king by cutting off the corner of his cloak. In this one, he symbolically has murdered him by taking the spear and the jar of water at his head. But Saul will not challenge him on that. Saul will respond to what David has to say. And there'll be a strange connection here with the Garden of Eden story and Cain, as we'll see from the language that David offers. So we'll turn to that in just a minute. We've been looking at our key words, and this was where we were last time. Now we're here, and we see how many times now is a key word. It might not seem like a key word because it's simply a temporal marker, but it's highlighting the urgency of that there's a choice here. Finally, now will be the time to have Saul give up on chasing off David and allow David to be at peace until the time comes where either Yahweh will strike him down or Saul will die of old age or he will die in battle, as we saw last scene. So here we'll close our scene, and as we do, let's begin to look at our story, recognizing the echoes and also recognizing the difference. And as soon as we get to verse 19, we'll look at something very different. So this section here is comparable to 24:10-6, as we've seen. And so David, having his voice being recognized, changes the subject completely. Why does my Lord, referring to Saul that way, notice not my Lord the king, as he referred to Saul when he was speaking to Abner. Simply my Lord, pursue his servant. Wrote off, linking with both chapter 24 and 25, as we saw. For what have I done? Which is a question that's been haunting David all the way back to chapter 17, and we've seen it 2 times before. We'll see it one more time. What have I done? And as many scholars, including Halpern, have noted in their depth of analysis of David in the narrative and also historically from what we can figure out, that might well be one of the big questions overall is, what has David done that allows us to either praise him or condemn him? And we'll be seeing much more of that in 2 Samuel. And then he adds, finally asking these 3 questions. What guilt is on my hands, or literally what evil? And asking those questions, he doesn't allow Saul to respond, but instead goes on like this. Now, therefore, let my Lord the king hear the words of his servants. He's already been speaking to him, so it's interesting that this comes after the 3 rhetorical questions here. This is a direct echo of Abigail to David in chapter 25, as we saw. Now he refers to my Lord the king, as we saw earlier in 24, and we'll do that one more time in chapter 29. Hear the words of the servant includes a please that we don't see in the New RSV, but there was also a please in Abigail's plea to David as well. So now, let's just listen to this and see if you can hear it before I bring up the chart that shows it. If it is the Lord who has stirred you up against me, may he accept an offering. But if it is mortals, may they be cursed before the Lord, for they have driven me out today from my share in the heritage of Yahweh, saying, go serve other gods. And that last little phrase, as Bodner notes it below, by far the strangest moment in David's speech. And although it's a Deuteronomistic history refrain, 5 times Deuteronomy, and you see all the other times, it makes no direct sense here. But all these pieces fit together this way. In case it wasn't noticed, you didn't notice it. The word for incited here, which is hard to pronounce without a vowel there, makes a several verse connection across the Hebrew Scripture and the New Testament. And I realize that adding revelation into interpretation of Samuel is not kosher, so to speak, because certainly the audience of 1 Samuel wouldn't know this. But I want to highlight that to show one connection that might well have been made by then because of Chronicles, not because of Revelation. So we hear in later in 2 Samuel 24 the same word. Again, the anger of Yahweh was kindled against Israel, and Yahweh incited David against them, saying, "Go count the people of Israel and Judah." So there we see the possibility that indeed it is Yahweh who is incited. And in Chronicles, though, embarrassed about the idea that Yahweh would incite someone to do something evil, they substitute Satan, which is certainly a post-exilic notion, because Satan comes from the Persian idea of the Satan, the royal spy who would be sent into the provinces, like Yehud, the Persian name for the region where Jerusalem was rebuilt, and spy on them and report back to the king. So in the New Testament, Satan becomes the prosecuting attorney, the one who accuses one before God, much like we see in the book of Job from the same time period as Chronicles. So we know that it substitutes Satan, and then back to Genesis we know it's the serpent. But in Genesis, the serpent is not equivalent to Satan, and many Christians read it that way because of Revelation. But reading Genesis on its own terms, the serpent is just one of the creatures who is described in Genesis 1 as made by Yahweh and made good, made by Elohim in chapter 1 actually. But Revelation makes that connection, and when that connection was made sometime between the time of exile and the time of the first century when John of Patmos had his vision, it's hard to say. But certainly it's possible to hear that connection between the serpent and Genesis and what's being cited here around inciting. And if that was all, I wouldn't push it, but we see if it is mortals here, translating Adam rather than human, which would be Ish, or people, which is Am, as we've seen rendered army in the New Revised Standard. So if it is mortals, or Adam, may they be cursed. And of course that's a direct connection with Genesis 3:17, where the Adam, so the ground is cursed because the Adam didn't listen. The Adam isn't cursed directly, but plainly is to get bread by the sweat of his brow, and to return to the earth with frustration over the thorns and thistles that come from agriculture. But this goes further. In the Cain story here, this is the version from 1 Samuel, as we see. They have driven me out. The same word is, I'm sorry, this isn't quite the Cain story yet. It's still the Garden of Eden story. He drove out the man and put a flaming sword and turning to guard the way to the tree of life, which is to say, the tree of life is the heritage of Yahweh. Certainly, John of Patmos' vision sees that, putting the tree of life in the New Jerusalem in the last chapters of Revelation and the last chapters of the Bible. So even though the authors of Samuel might not directly be thinking of the tree of life as the heritage of Yahweh, the heritage of Yahweh might be understood as the land or the community or the relationship. Certainly the tree of life and the Garden of Eden are supposed to represent that. And many scholars, including the husband of my former colleague Cynthia Molobita, Ron Molobita, wrote a little book on the Garden of Eden story as a criticism of monarchy, as I note too in my book Come Out My People, although I didn't make this connection with 1 Samuel. But it continues into the Cain story. Now, therefore, do not let my blood fall to the ground. And we hear in Genesis 4, Yahweh said, your brother's blood is crying out to me from the ground. And finally, David says, you've driven me away from the presence of Yahweh. Down in the next verse, we can see down here. Driven me away from the presence of Yahweh, and we see Cain went away from the presence of Yahweh. So there's the whole curse and expulsion story hidden into this. And why might that be there? I'd like to suggest it's part of the reason that these chapters were inserted in the a post-exilic period to highlight the question of, was monarchy a good idea or not? And is it Yahweh or not who is behind this whole process? So in other words, is it Yahweh who stirred up the people to want a monarchy in the first place? Is it Yahweh who's working to undermine the monarchy? Later in 2 Samuel, we'll certainly see that it's Yahweh working to undermine David, given some of the terrible things David does. But we simply don't know the bigger picture. So we did see in 1 Samuel 8, though, that Yahweh said to Samuel, listen to their voice, they've rejected me, let them have a king and see how it goes. So in the end, when it ends up with Jerusalem destroyed and the people in exile, perhaps they put these chapters back in to say, in responding to that question, it didn't go well, let's not have a king. But that's hard to read just from this verse, but all this stuff is there, so we have to acknowledge that. And why the go serve other gods? Well, it certainly links to the Deuteronomistic history as one of the primary problems that people had. Rather than relying on Yahweh, they relied on the gods of other nations. So an interesting little insertion here. in those two chapters. But then it goes back to the language we heard from chapter 24 with this dead dog here that we saw in a single flea connecting with chapter 24. So we don't know the dead dog here, but we have the single flea, and only in those two places. And then there's a really fun play on words that many people get, like one who hunts a partridge in the mountains. But the word for partridge, kore, simply means the caller, and therefore it echoes Abner's query in verse 14, "Who are you, O caller?" And as Samora notes here, thus in David's reply, he wryly compares himself to the caller hunted in the mountains. And it also echoes 24:9 that I just looked at in terms of the single flea and the dead dog. So with those things, Saul now responds to all these interesting comments that David makes, although he doesn't respond specifically to those things. And he does an amazing amount of stuff in this one verse. As my note below says, he confesses 3 ways, vows 1 way, pleads with David, and praises him, all in one verse. We need to look at the Hebrew more closely to see exactly what's going on here. So it says, now Saul said, I have done wrong, and sometimes wrong translates evil, but here it translates chatat, sin. I have sinned. And as Fackelman notes below, making these connections, I won't show them all, but the 7th and final sin of Saul. And the fact that it's 7 is certainly unlikely to be a coincidence, 7 being a number of completion. So the authors sprinkling those examples of Saul's sin from chapter 15 back with when Samuel challenged him in that story, and then in 19, and now here. So 7 sins, you're out, Saul. And then he says, the moment he says, I've sinned, then he says, return, my son David. And maybe we can get the tone here that Saul is just pouring out these things, trying to plead with David here, although his life is not at risk. So he's not in danger the way we saw Abigail pleading and pleading and pleading with David when she's facing 600 or 400 armed men who are angry. David is off on the hill at a great distance, and he's got his men, so there's no immediate sense that Saul is threatening to charge at him with his soldiers, and yet he pleads for him to come back, my son David, calling him that again for the 2nd time in our chapter, and it'll be one more time as we'll see. For I will never harm you again, or I will not do evil to you again, and also echoing what we've seen before. So let me keep the keywords up so we can follow this here, because precious is 3 times here, but it's not the same word each time. So having made one confession, he pleads with David to come back. He makes a vow never to harm again. He thanks David implicitly because my life was precious in your sight, meaning that you didn't kill me, using the word yakred here, which was expressed in 1830 for David's fame, but only one other time here in the monarchy narrative. We'll see it's a different word below. Then he says, I have been a fool, and unfortunately for our symmetry, it's not the same word as Nabal, as we'll see. New RSV as always omits one of the beholds, and we see 3 beholds in his speech here. I have been a fool, using this word, skull, it's hard to pronounce again. We saw it, though, echoing 13:13, and let's go back to that, because that one's important to see, where Samuel said to Saul, you have done foolishly, you have not kept the commandment of the Lord your God. And so here he says, I've been a fool, and I have strayed greatly. Making a great mistake covers over what we hear from the Hebrew, I have strayed greatly. So he confesses, I have sinned, I've done foolishly, and I've strayed greatly. Who is he confessing for? He's not confessing before Yahweh explicitly. He's confessing before David, as if he expected David to allow him to be recovered from that, like he did with Samuel. Whereas Samuel shook him away, and Saul pulled on Samuel's cloak, and it tore, and Samuel said, that's symbolic of the kingdom that's going to be taken away from you. They're at a distance here, so there's no opportunity for direct interaction. Instead, we hear David's reply. Here is the spear, O king. Let one of the young men come over and get it. And notice, David doesn't reply to any of it. He doesn't forgive Saul. He doesn't ask, you didn't respond to my questions. He doesn't respond to any of it. So although Saul has poured out many things, it's really not much of a conversation here. They're really each saying what they have to say, but not hearing each other and not responding to each other. And perhaps that's symbolic of the larger struggle as well. So as Saul had a behold, David has a behold. Behold the spear, O king. And as my note below notes, the spear, yes, the spear, it's doubled here, but no mention or offer to return the water jar, suggesting it was Saul's own spear by which Abishai offered to pin the king and only have to do it once, as we saw earlier in verse 8. So let one of the young men come over and get it. He'd also offered Abner to come over and get it. Abner didn't, and neither did the young men. Why not? Why does David want them to come over and get it? just to get it back and see? Does he want to kidnap those young men if they come over? We have no idea, but it doesn't happen. As we see there. So then he becomes theological on it, and let's scroll down to see the end of our section here so we can see all of it as we go. So Yahweh rewards everyone for his righteousness and faithfulness, making this proverbial statement here. Literally, the word for rewards is returns, highlighting the fact that Saul called David to return to him, and David ignored it. But Yahweh returns everyone for his righteousness or justice and his faithfulness. An interesting phrase, probably a hendiadys, where the two words are understood as one idea together. Faithful righteousness or righteous faithfulness, as we might hear. Umuna for faithfulness is only here in Samuel and only 2 times in 2 Kings. The phrase together is only once in the Psalms. Faithfulness is not really a theme in the Deuteronomistic history, at least not in the monarchy story. It is in Deuteronomy, but not in the monarchy story so much. And there's an explanation for it here. Yahweh returns everyone for his righteousness and faithfulness, for Yahweh gave you into my hand today. And notice that's taking up Abishai's theology, that the fact that they were asleep there meant that Yahweh had done that. And we again know that Yahweh had put the deep sleep on Saul and his people, but David doesn't know that. Abishai certainly didn't know that. So this theology is being concluded that Yahweh made this situation. And how does that play against David's sense earlier that Yahweh would take care of it, or Saul would die of old age, or Saul would die in battle, but he wouldn't be put into David's hand? But David says, I would not raise my hand against Yahweh's anointed, which is a strange thing. He's suggesting that Yahweh wanted him to raise his hand against Yahweh's anointed, and David won't do it, which would be going against Yahweh's will to kill Yahweh's anointed. That's kind of convoluted, and that can't really be what the authors expect David to be saying here, that Yahweh put Saul into David's hands so David could kill him. But what we have here is that David didn't kill him for the second time. And he continues in this way, affirming what Saul said, and it's not quite chiastic, but it does fit around that. As your life was precious, omitting another behold here, as we see finally, as your life, and note repeated verbatim in the Hebrew by substituting Yahweh for mine. So the 2 lines are identical, and we've seen other examples of that earlier in this chapter. So as your life was precious today, or literally has become great, or I valued your life, may my life be precious in the sight of Yahweh. And notice the comparison, that Saul's life was precious simply in the eyes of David, but David is praying that his life be precious in the eyes of Yahweh, and he may rescue me from all tribulation. Using nitzol, one of the 2 words, along with Yeshua for rescue or deliver, 17 times in 1 Samuel. And it's worth looking here at 2 Samuel 4:9 to see the comparison here. As Yahweh lives, who has redeemed my life from every adversity, when the one who told me, see, Saul is dead, thought he was bringing good news. But that's for a little later in 1 Samuel. And the word for tribulation is zara here, recalling 10:19, where Samuel chastised the people for not relying on Yahweh to save them. And so this produces an interesting outcome here. And this is the verse I just looked at, recalling Saul's death as rescue. We'll see it one more time in David to Bathsheba, echoing this phrase. But what it implies is, interestingly, an anti-monarchy plea. If David is calling on Yahweh to rescue from all tribulation, then you don't need a king, because Yahweh is there to rescue all of them from all tribulation. And so this section really does play against what we'll see in 2 Samuel 7, the highest level of the understanding of Davidic monarchy and dynasty, where Nathan in Yahweh's name promises that a descendant of David will always sit on the throne in Jerusalem, which of course in the event didn't happen. So we recognize that in these books is both a pro-monarchy and anti-monarchy view, maybe from the same time period or maybe from different time periods. But these 3 chapters, 24 to 26, are almost certainly from a later time period. So we reach the very end here where Saul says to David, blessed be you, my son, echoing David to Abigail in chapter 25, and again saying my son for the 3rd time. And notice what Saul says and doesn't say. You will do many things and will succeed in them. But he doesn't say you'll be the king. He doesn't say you'll succeed me and you're Yahweh's anointed. Let's look a little more closely at the verses here, the words here. Bodner notes below, but pointedly not mentioning serving as king, as I was just noting. You will do many things, and it's double again. You do, yes, do. And succeed or prevail or endure is the literal meaning of the word, against the earlier judgment in 17:33 and 39 that David could not take on Goliath because he was too young and inexperienced. So it ends there, and the narrator ends this in a very very interestingly vague way. We saw at the end of chapter 24, which I can bring up here, that Saul went home and David and his men went up to the stronghold. But here we said David went his way, wherever that is, and Saul returned to his place, wherever that is, noting that a place was a key word from the beginning all the way down to the end. Is his place the throne? Is his place his hometown up here in Gibeah? Or his place, as we're going to see, dead in a few chapters? So that ends our 3 chapters, and we'll see in chapter 27, David still thinks he's going to perish at the hands of Saul, so he'll go become a Philistine mercenary for a while. And we'll see how that goes next time. See you then. Bye-bye.